to introduce David. David Jennings is a wildlife conservationist first and a native bee enthusiast second. He has a forestry wildlife degree from the University of Georgia and a master's in biostatistics from the University of Oklahoma. David cut his conservation teeth working on slowing down the rate of clear cutting of public forests in Georgia, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, and here in Washington. When President Clinton's forest plan was announced, David helped form and then lead the Gifford-Pinchot task force for 15 plus years, successfully halting the continued logging of ancient forest on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Southwest Washington. David was appointed to the State Wildlife Commission in 2009, and then Governor Gregoire, uh, by then Governor Gregoire, where he served for 4 years. During his tenure, he was instrumental in getting the commission to unanimously adopt a wolf conservation recovery plan that is still in place today. David's conservation interests in pollinators were piqued following publication of the book The Forgotten Pollinators, published in 1996, but was stymied by the lack of accessible ID tools. When David discovered the Xerxes Society's Bumblebee Watch project, enabling people to photograph bumblebees and submit their photos to Xerxes to get the bumblebees identified to the species, he was hooked. He spent several years traveling around the state to photograph all species of bumblebees found in Washington. In the process, he met Don Rolfs, who introduced him to all of the other native species, bee species we have here. David has photographed every species of bumblebees known to occur here, and along with Don Rolfs and Lisa Robinson, helped discover a new state record, the high country bumblebee. Inspired by Lisa Robinson's enthusiasm for native bees, David joined the Oregon Bee Project, traveling around Oregon's backcountry looking for native bees. He then served as a major catalyst to have the Washington legislature authorize the Washington State Department of Agriculture to start our native bee atlas. His talk tonight covers pollinators in general, with a focus on why native bees are the best pollinators. His talk will close with a brief discussion of conservation issues facing our pollinators and what positive steps we are taking to improve our landscape for pollinators in the future. And without further ado, David, please take it away.
This is just a high-level talk about native bees and other pollinators and why, in a lot of ways, bees are the best pollinators. A lot of pretty pictures and some discussion. So I liked this picture. I caught it, took it up in near Slate Peak, and I was all excited because my first naive reaction was, "Oh, look, the bees waving to the butterfly." And then Don pointed out that no, that's a sign of irritation, sort of like flipping up your middle finger as opposed to your middle leg. And because he had both of them up, it's just kind of funny. The other thing about this picture is that when you look at it closely, wait, you can see that what we would call a flower is actually many smaller flowers inside. So each of these is its own flower that has nectar and pollen in it. So you can see that there's lots of different flowers within what we would call, when we look at it, a single flower. When I learned what the, middle leg extended meant, I thought this was a pretty funny picture. And you can almost make it out that there's a little finger sticking out at the end of each one as two bees looking at each other saying, "I was here first. I don't care. I'm here anyway." That's just some humor. Just want to say some acknowledgments. The Native Bee Society has been a great boon. I'm really enjoying being on the board with everybody, and where we started and where we are now is just amazing. Dr. Chris Looney works for the Department of Ag, and he's been a real mentor to me over the years. You already heard how Don really helped me get started, and Lisa. So Don, Lisa, and I were sort of a little team for a while, and now it's grown beyond that. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about background, and then biology of bees, some common pollinators, then why bees are special, native pollinator conservation, and then maybe take questions at the end. Just to remind people, so this is a flower. This is two major parts from a pollination perspective. One is the stamen with the anther, which is where the pollen is produced by the flower. And the other is the pistil. And the important part of the pistil from pollination perspective is the stigma, which is the opening that the pollen has to get into to come down and turn into a fruit or a seed. So The pollination is the exchange of genetic material of pollen between flowers for reproduction. But for it to be successful, it has to be between flowers or plants of the same species. There may be a few hybrids that happen but in general, bluebirds fly with bluebirds and redbirds fly with redbirds, and the same is kind of true for flowers. Without pollination, most flowering plants can't reproduce. About 50%, and we think about those like pine trees and ragweed, they use wind to help their pollen. And as a result, they produce massive volumes of pollen because wind can be such an inefficient way to do it. But when you look at the evolution of flowering plants uh, and bees, you recognize that very quickly, uh, once the flowering plants started getting diversified, bees hooked up with them, and the diversity of flowering plants and bees sort of go together in the evolutionary sense. Um, Plants, wildlife, and us, we all need pollinators. Pollinated plants produce fruits, berries, seeds, nuts, new plants, and more flowers, all of which we like, and so does the rest of nature. So when we talk about native pollinators, like who are they, what are they doing, and why do we really care about it? Pollinators come in a lot of different forms. Most pollinators are insects, bees, butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, beetles, and such. But there's also vertebrate pollinators. Birds like hummingbirds. Bats are known to do it for saguaro cactus. And I learned recently there's some lizards in South America that are instrumental in some uh, pollination, uh, pollinating some flowers. These are just a few pretty pictures of some of our butterflies and other common pollinators we have. One thing I'll point out with this is this long proboscis or tongue that they use to insert into the flowers to get the nectar out. For the most part, most pollinators are accidental pollinators, and they're really going to the flower for the nectar that the flower is, quote unquote, producing for the bees to attract them in. Uh, but certainly, we heard there's some exceptions, but in general, uh, most pollinators aren't as efficient as pollinating flowers as bees are. You can see this one with her tongue inserted proboscis down into the flower to get that nectar we were talking about. I used to be president of Butterfly Association, and there are some amazing butterflies we have in Washington. That's a really fun group. I hooked up with them because they knew where all the flowering meadows were, so I'd go out with them to look for my bees and bumblebees, and but in the process, I ended up getting hooked also on with butterflies. So this is another butterfly, but you may or may not notice yet that there's a beetle on there. So beetles are also pollinators. And again, they may be going for nectar, they may be going for pollen to eat for protein sources, but they're a little they're not too efficient. Let me put it that way. Some might be, but in general, they're doing their best not to get pollen on them and not necessarily go to a flower of the same species. Moths turns out to be a really big group of pollinators. A lot of the moth pollinators are night-based, because we think most moths are night flying, but we do have day flying moths also. And one of my favorites is what they call a clear wing moth, and they get that name pretty clearly because you can see right through their wings. They're translucent, so you can see the color of the plant behind it. What I will point out is again this very long proboscis for going in to get the nectar. And then there's bees. This is a brown belted bumblebee over on the east side. Some characteristics that help you identify it as a bee to start with is they have long straight antennae. They're a little joint here. but a long antenna. And at least the females often almost always when you see them are carrying pollen somewhere on their body. They're furry. They have a lot of hairs. A lot of those hairs are plumose, or sort of break into pieces to really grab and hold on to the pollen they collect. So this bumblebee, wait, is this a bumblebee? Kind of looks like it, but if you notice, it doesn't have long antenna, and the eyes relative to the head are enormous. So this is a fly, a bee mimic. But at least when I was first starting out, these would often catch my eye, and I'd, go get the picture and then say, oh, wait, it's not a bumblebee. But it's kind of fun to notice how many different flies mimic both bees and wasps. Speaking of wasps, wasps help pollinate. Wasps go there probably as an adult for a little bit of protein from the pollen and also energy from the nectar. They have very long, skinny legs, which is one easy way to do it. But there's so many different types of wasps, it's hard to come up with a generic way to identify them, other than you will not see them with pollen on their body. This is a wasp mimic. This is another fly, but if you look at it closely, you can see really, really short antenna and really, really big eyes. So, flies do their best to not get eaten by birds and other things that might avoid a wasp or a bee. So there are a lot of interesting bee mimics. The other thing I like about this picture is the order of flies is called diptera, which stands for two wings, but they actually have two rudimentary wings, and you can kind of see them here on each side on this particular species. So they're not functional wings. They won't really help them fly, but they're rudimentary. And this is a fairly typical type of fly you'll see that has a lot of the same black and yellow markings or striping on it that makes you think it's a bee. But again, when you look, it's got really, really short antenna and proportionally really large eyes. So without the long antenna, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, that's a fly. So why do we have a focus? Why do we have a native bee society? Why do I care as a conservationist about native bees? Well, they're keystone species, and that if you remove them from the landscape, that that community structure changes quickly. If you don't have bees doing pollinating, a lot of the native plants will disappear uh, because other pollinators aren't nearly as efficient, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And also because they are very important, but most people don't even notice them. I didn't notice native bees until I started talking to Don, and then I went back to my garden and saw all these little things flying around and looked closer. It's like, oh wait, I had no idea that I had so many native bee species in my yard. I think I've seen estimates that over the course of the summer, because uh, each species changes on the landscape, so you can have up to like 15 to 30 different species of bees. Another reason that motivates me to work with native bees is there's a lot of evidence that like a lot of other species, native bee species diversity is plummeting. I will talk about that a little bit later. Um, I'm going to throw in a couple of pieces of trivia. One is, and I got this from Tony, and I thought it was such a good question. You don't have to answer me now, just think about it. How many eyes does a bee have? And I forgot the other question because I'm talking and I'm nervous. So I'll come back to that in a minute. What makes bees special from a pollinator perspective is that both the adult and larvae only eat or consume nectar and pollen. And while there's a little group of wasps who do it functionally, bees are the ones that have this lifestyle. They're the only group that forage that way. Bee larvae use natural fungus that's naturally occurring in the landscape on the pollen. So when they bring the pollen and nectar back into their brood cell, then the fungus starts to break down the pollen into a liquid that the bee larvae can eat. The implication of this that came to light a few years ago is in areas that use a lot of fungicide, it turns out bee larvae end up starving because without fungus spores in the brood cavity, the pollen doesn't break down, and pollen is a very big, dense bunch of large proteins. And without the pollen to break it into something edible, the bee larvae can't really eat it. The other point I was going to say is the average solitary bee lives for about a year. And my question is, how many, how long is the adult on the landscape during that 12-month period? Bees are the only group that deliberately, intentionally collect and move pollen from flower to flower. And I'm going to back up and put in this qualifier. I'm talking in a generic way about native bees. Native bees, we have 4,000 species or more in the United States. Lots of diverse lifestyles. We have cryptoparasites and others, but in the classic bee group, we're talking this is the behavior. Um, so they collect pollen and then go to another flower. And you can see the relationship between bees and flowering plants when you realize that 80+% of all insect pollinated flowering plants use bees as their pollinators. And that's just because, with some exceptions, other insects are just much less efficient. They have a very different lifestyle than the bees because they're not feeding their young pollen and nectar. You know, the wasps we see feed their young insects, sort of meat to grow up. And the butterflies, lay their eggs, and the caterpillars eat plants. So it's because the bees feed their young nectar and pollen is why they've turned out to be such good pollinators for plants. And here's an example. This is one of my favorite daytime moths. It's that clear-winged moth. But look how it's feeding on this flower. It's bracing its front feet against the flower, holding its body away, and then sticking its proboscis down in there to get the nectar. It doesn't want to get pollen on it. It just wants to get the nectar. And so it's doing its best not to get covered with pollen because pollen can be kind of sticky and gets in the way. And so, but when you look at it from the plant perspective, the plant's giving it nectar, but not really getting much in return. It's not really getting an opportunity to get its pollen taken to another flower of the same plant to have pollination occur. This is that same the same moth from behind. And again, you can really see how where it gets the name is clear wing. You can see the flower just directly through it. But I don't know if you notice in the picture down below is a little tiny native bee. And rather than avoiding getting pollen, it's rolling in it, just trying to get as much as it can packed on its body to take back and put it in the brood cell for its larvae. So bees deliberately collect pollen as opposed to most other insects that are just coming for nectar. Here's an example of a fly, and again, you can see it doesn't want to get pollen on it. It's got this really long proboscis just sticking into the flower to get the nectar, but it has no use for the pollen, so it just soon avoid it. In addition to deliberately collecting pollen and then transporting it to other flowers, because it doesn't get all the pollen it needs in a single trip, um, bees exhibit another behavior that's highly desirable from a plant's perspective, and that is a term called constancy. And constancy, has a definition of faithful and dependable. But in the case of a bee, what it says is an individual bee, not a group of bees, but an individual bee comes out, emerges, has no idea, and I'm talking polylectic bees that will use multiple flowers. There are some desert bees and others that are very, tied to a single plant or a single genus, but most bees are fairly generic about what they'll use, depending on what's on the landscape. But the individual bee learns how to work the plant, how to unlock and be efficient at getting the pollen out of the plant. And so once it learns to be efficient at getting pollen from that individual plant, it will go to that same plant over and over again, which from the plant's perspective is an amazing boon because all of a sudden it knows that the pollen that it's donating or having taken by the bee is going to go to a flower of the same species, greatly increasing the probability of pollination happening. And what we see when you look is a lot of flowers have built their uh, uh, opening for the tube, and I showed you guys a name, and I'm drawing a blank on it now. Not the stamen, but the anyway, so that when the bee comes in, the bee can collect bee cleans itself of all the pollen it gets on it and then sticks it where it's going to carry it on its abdomen or on its legs or uh, but it can't really reach the top of its back very well. And so a lot of plants have it so when the bee goes in to get more pollen, it's going to brush against the tube that's going to capture just 1 or 2 grains of pollen for pollination to happen. And that's why the plants are happy to put out lots of pollen because it only takes a few grains from their perspective to be successful. But if they have enough, they're going to be attracting bees who are going to be gathering it and taking it from flower to flower. As I said, she learns how to work the flower to maximize her efficiency, make it time sensitive. She's trying to do a whole lot in a small amount of time. And, so she'll first visit all the flowers that she can that she knows of that species. And only when she can't find that flower or that flower's already been sampled by other people, other insects, well, will she go to another species of plant. But the whole point is by doing that behavior, going to the same species over and over, that's really key for plants to be pollinated. And it's different for each individual bee. It's not necessarily a species level thing. That's if you are able to use multiple flowers, then each individual bee figures out what they're going to start with and goes from there. And you can see constancy when you look at the bees, because in this case, this is a yellow-headed bee, yellow-faced bee. The pollen is all the same color, showing it's all coming from the same plant because each plant has a different color pollen. So this individual has only been going to that one plant over and over again, gathering the pollen it's going to take back. Here's a Nevada bumblebee, same thing. You look at the pollen that's been gathered and it's all the same color, showing it's only going to one species of plant while it's on this foraging run, greatly increasing the probability of pollination for the plant. This is one of my favorite pictures just because I like the colors that I picked up in it, but also look at the size of the pollen basket that it's carrying. And it's got one that same size on the other side of its body to balance it out. That's just a lot of pollen. But again, when you look at the color, it's all one color. So it's going to the same species of plant over and over to get that, greatly increasing the probability of pollination for the plant. Not all bees carry their pollen on their legs. We talked about in the bee share, um, megacylids that carry it on the abdomen. In this case, it's all yellow, and it's all yellow. That's all pollen that she's picked up. But again, it's all one color, showing that she's going to the same species of plant over and over, over and over. That orange on this one. So it's not just bumblebees, it's, many different species of native bees have that behavior of constancy. But, she's out there, and if she can't find any more of the same plant that she had learned how to harvest efficiently, she'll switch to a different species of flower. But as you can see here, she was first starting with the orange pollen, and then she ran out. She couldn't find any more, so she changed to a new flower type, a new flower species. But that top one isn't a bunch of different color pollens. She found another flower, learned how to use it, efficiently harvest from it, and is now going to that flower over and over again. So the point is you can see constancy in action in the field. So you can tell that they are really going to the same species of plant. In general, so native bees, we have 4,000+ species in the US. We probably have about 700 in Washington. We know we have about 585 known species. And looking at other areas like Oregon, we're kind of predicting we'll find another 125 not yet documented in Washington. Some of them probably are new to science, and some are just not ever found, not yet collected here in Washington state. Here's just a few other pictures of some of the native bees we have, and these are from Don Rawl pictures, just showing a little bit of the diversity we have. And you look at those hairs on the legs, they have really been designed to have pollen stick to them. Between negative and positive energies from the earth being grounded and the bees flying in the air, there's an electrical charge that pulls them on, and the hairs themselves are sort of designed to have lots of area to capture and hold those pollen grains. Some field shots, and you can just see her rolling around in it. So there's a lot of different ways to break up bees. Taxonomically, we have 6 families of bees in Washington. We expect to have 6. We know we have 5, and the other one, weed, is a specialized bee, but we're going to be looking for it because it's both in British Columbia and in Oregon. So it's here. We just haven't found it yet and documented it. But an easy way to look at them is where they nest. Most bees nest in the ground. Solitary bees, they dig their own holes. They maybe do it in groups and large. And if the right soils are right, you'll get quite a few species, quite a few individuals using that same general area. So it's pretty amazing when you find uh, ground emerging, ground nesting bees because you can see thousands of them, all coming out. Others are called tunnel nesting. They're find holes in stems or other sites, like mason bee tubes. That's about a third of the bees. And then about 10% we call social bees, where they have a caste system of queen, workers, and drones. Um, and they often are ground nesting, but they can be also in holes in trees or other places. Again, many different ways to group them, but this is just an easy way to start figuring out where to look. So I was over at Mima Mounds, which is here in Thurston County, and I glanced down on the trail and I saw something that caught my eye and I said, oh, that looks like a bee. And then I looked closer and it's like, oh yeah, that's a bee covered with pollen. And then I watched a little bit longer and I saw, oh, and it's a ground nesting bee that just went underground and had so much pollen on it that part of the pollen got scraped off as it went into its nesting tube, nesting hole. So that's an example of what a ground nesting bee might look like if you see it as a solitary individual. Shifting a little bit to conservation, a lot of pollinator populations are in pretty steep declines. A few are expanding their ranges. They're taking advantage of being able to uh, adapt to an urban environment, adapt to cities, uh, because a lot of people have plants out that they're able to forage on. But the reality is, with 700, 585 known species, we don't know anything about the population trends uh, on any particular bee. One of the phrases that I've heard from is that rare bees are common. And that means when you start looking at large numbers of bees that you collect, many of them you only get a couple of individuals and you might not see them every year, even if you go back to the same area. But in the big picture, we know that that the population trends aren't good for bees and a lot of other insects and nature in general. We've got global warming and that's changing things, and the challenge is it may be changing things faster than species can easily adapt to those changes, plants and animals. It's also throwing off timing of when the plants are emerging versus when the bees are used to them coming out. So we're seeing some disconnects. It's clear that compared to 200 years ago, we have a lot of habitat loss, and the habitat we have is often degraded, either used, grazed very heavily or has a lot of invasive plants in it, or other reasons it's not the quality habitat it had been. A big challenge is habitat fragmentation. You can think about a piece of habitat as an island, and local extinctions happen a lot. But if that island is close to other islands, they will get crossover and get, that species will come back because it'll, uh, during when they're out flying, they'll find that new spot and sort of recolonize it. But what we're seeing is the habitat fragments are getting smaller and they're getting further apart from each other. And smaller means that there's a smaller base population in that island of habitat, which means that they're much more likely to be impacted by just random events because you don't have as many individuals to survive. If it's something that kills, 1 in 100, but you only have 150 bees, then it'll start looking bad for them at a population level. We also have invasive species, both species we bring over. We have an introduced bumblebee now called Eastern Common Bumblebee that's coming down the west side of the mountains. It had been brought into British Columbia for helping buzz pollinate tomato plants, but it got out of the greenhouses, and now it's moving. It seems to be moving slower than we thought. And uh, Chris Looney, who I mentioned earlier, has been doing with others a 5-year study of the impact of the Eastern Common Bumblebee. And the good news is they're not finding a lot. It seems to be taking a sort of unoccupied niche. We don't see a lot of viruses or other diseases coming from it yet. It's still a work in progress, but it's not quite the rapidly exploding population we were concerned about. And, big one is pesticides. Neonicotinoids are a big one that doesn't necessarily kill the bee, but it really changes its behavior. And fungicides. And I'm just going to back up to neonics a minute. Europe's banned a lot of neonics because of the concerns that it has on insects and pollinators in particular. The way we have been in the United States permitting pesticides, one key piece of it is what they call LD50. And that stands for the lethal dose that will affect 50% of the individuals who are exposed to it. But neonics don't really kill quickly. They just change the behavior, makes the bees less focused, maybe a little, stoned or drunk or something. And so they're not very efficient pollinators. So when you don't have much time and you're clumsy and you can't find your way back, it really can impact you. But our test, when the EPA did the test, they weren't thinking about behavior as opposed to just dead or not dead. And with fungicides, I mentioned earlier that the adult bee collects pollen and nectar and puts it in that brood cell, but also brings in, not deliberately, but just because they're in the environment, fungal spores that then break down that food into a liquid that the larvae can eat. So in the Midwest, they were doing studies on bees and finding really low success rates. And when they moved in the lab to try and figure out why, they realized fungicides was a big part of the problem. And that's kind of new. We're just figuring that out in the past few years. I don't think we have that many fungicides used in Washington, but it's just something to be thoughtful about. We're also seeing declines in insects, apparently worldwide. This was a study was published in 2017. They did a 27-year study in protected areas in Germany. So they're all sort of, nature preserves. And they've been studying them for these past years. And they did an interesting thing. They just looked at, well, we don't want to count them all. That's a whole lot of work. We don't have the resources. So we're just going to collect the insects. They use malaise traps where they, standalone trap where anything that's flying sort of goes in there and falls into a container that collects them. They just looked at total flying insect biomass. What they found was in the middle of summer, over that 27 years, the total flying insect biomass declined by over 80%. And you can see in the headlines over the course of a year of that field season, spring, summer, fall, it's at least a 75% decline. And those are protected areas. Those are places that were supposed to be reservoirs for nature. And that was a greater decline that could be defined by the weather, land use, habitat characteristics. They don't really have an understanding of why. But when you think about how important insects are for ecosystems, it's pretty significant. It's pretty scary. Uh, Again, we talked about bees helping pollinate flowers, but also if we don't have butterflies to produce caterpillars, a lot of our birds won't be very successful. I read recently that the average pair of chickadees raising a brood brings something approaching 6,000 caterpillars back to the nest over the course of that raising their young. But if you don't have butterflies, you have many fewer caterpillars. And so birds start to decline because they can't find the food source. And then within bees in particular, they did a study. And the assumption, I think, was that with the uh, iNaturalists and all the citizen groups and citizens out there photographing nature, that in the past 30 years, we would be seeing more species documented. But in fact, when they looked at the data, they found that of all the species that were known between in the 1990s, when they looked at the data collected between 2006 and 2015, 25% fewer bee species were reported. So that was happened. That was an international study. They just looked at all the databases, but a decline of that big in 25 years is kind of scary to me. And then people did a study here in the US looking at bees that they had data on. And the ones that they had data, they found about half of them were declining. And half of the ones that were declining seemed to be declining so rapidly that they were worried about them staying on the landscape. I think that's a hard conclusion to accept, knowing what I know about how difficult it is to study native bee population trends. Uh, and this is an environmental group who probably wants to have us be worried and start changing our behaviors. But still, the point is, we're our bees are not necessarily stable populations. This is analysis looking at bees that we use in agriculture, and I just want to point out that, you know, Eastern Washington, especially with the alfalfa bee, really depends on bees for helping agricultural crops. And it's not just bees. This is a study that came out in 2021 that said we've looked at 450 different butterfly species in the West, and those 450 have all been declining at a rate of about 2% a year. Um, but over 40 years, that's a pretty big decline. And we don't see it getting better. Between global warming and loss of habitat, the trends aren't good for insects. But I don't want to focus on that because really the focus is how do we make it better? We can make a meaningful difference at the individual yard level. And I look at Joe's yard with all the plants he's got and the diversity of bees he finds. That's exactly what we are hoping many people will do, will plant pollinator-friendly plants in their yard and maybe get their neighbors to do the same thing. So you're really building up a community that shares values around pollination, supporting pollinators. There's a lot of things we could do for public land management. In our cities and counties, we can talk about how do we manage undeveloped areas? How do we set up pollinator zones and parks and then not just have them be ball fields? And DOT and county DOT, Department of Transportation, have really started doing some pretty good things with roadside management, planting pollinator habitat in not necessarily in the right of ways, but on each side of the road. And the governor, I have to give he and his wife a lot of credit. They've done a lot of work changing the landscape of the governor's grounds to make them much more pollinator plant friendly helping both honeybees and native bees. We have a lot of potential with wildlife management areas who could very, if they were asked to and joined in, could do a lot more for developing and supporting pollinator habitat. And state parks, people like, so I'm just saying there's a lot of state lands that have the potential to be really good for pollinators. So what can we do? How do we do better? Well, first is just like you guys are here, we want to learn about them, respect what they add to the landscape and to help us, and then help protect them so we have them into the future. Native plants are key. Um, it's turning out that a lot of imported plants from Europe and Asia and other places are pretty, but our native insects, probably not bees. Bees are pretty, happy to use pollen and nectar of any source, but native plants provide food for our insects because our insects have evolved with our native plants to be able to eat them. Plants don't want to be eaten, so they produce something called secondary compounds. And back when I was in graduate school, people were just trying to figure out why they were putting all the energy into secondary compounds, the plants. And then it turns out that those are things designed to make them not palatable to insects. But the local insects have evolved with that same plant. So there's this arms race between I'm more, I taste bad. I don't care. I'm going to be able to eat you anyway. But you bring in plants from other parts of the world, and our insects can't digest or eat those plants' secondary compounds. So all of a sudden, those plants, if they're at all invasive, don't have natural predators on the landscape like insects to help slow them down, and they're able to outcompete a lot of our plants. So again, focus on native plants. And for things that will be blooming spring through fall. And don't forget, as Will Peterson often talks about, bees need dirt. You know, provide nesting habitat, be thoughtful about what you do to part of your yard so that they have a place to overwinter. Bumblebees go into the soil, into the underneath the leaf litter. Uh, just, just be thoughtful about not having everything be grass or mowed or cleaned up. And really, one of the reasons we're here as a native bee society is to push public policy. Let's be more native pollinator friendly. Let's be thoughtful about what we're doing. And I have to say, Washington is a pretty amazing state. They have been doing such good work around pollinators, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But also talk about, do we want fungicides and neonicotinoid pesticides on public lands or used by nurseries? If it's going to actually hurt. One of the big concerns is that people want pretty plants when they go to the nursery. So the nurseries have been applying neonicotinoids to keep all the insects off of them. But when those neonics get on your plant, they stay with the plant in the seeds, in the pollen, and for several years. So it's not just you can't rinse them off, it'll be gone. They are embedded in each cell. And really stand up and say, I like pollinators and we need to be supporting them. So all of these things really help. I'm going to give a shout out to Ellen Miller with the Washington State Beekeepers Association. She invited the Native Bee Society to a pollinator festival that they had here in Thurston County. And I went. Let me pause. I got ahead of myself. So when Don Rawls and I were running around the state looking for bees, we often went to the high country, and Don hated honeybees. He thought they were a scourge. He thought they were competing directly with our native species. He was furious that he'd find them on public lands. Um, and so since I didn't hear a different perspective, I sort of was in that same camp. Oh yeah, honeybees, don't have much value except honey. But when Ellen invited me to her group's Pollinator Fest, I looked and I walked in, talking about in my head and actually with her about the challenge of honeybees. But as I spent the day with her and others, I realized we had a lot in common. And one of the big things we had in common was needing more pollinator habitat. Because really, a lot of the conflicts I have with honeybees is because they're competing for resources. But if we are able to jointly help get more resources on the ground, it not only helps bees, both honeybees and native bees, but also all the other pollinator species that we are depending on, not necessarily because they're great pollinators, but because they produce food like caterpillars to help fuel our ecosystems. So finding that habitat commonality really, really opened my eyes up. And so now Ellen and I and the Native Bee Society and the Washington State Honeybee Association are finding mutual areas of interest to work together. So thank you, Ellen. So what we found was habitat is key. Should have made these only pop up one at a time, but um, our state legislature, the past two sessions, has passed legislation that said, um, well, it started off saying local government, when you do major ground disturbing activities like putting in a new building and having to, that when you replant, we want you to plant at least 25% of the disturbed area with pollinator habitat. It started off, the legislation started off with thou shall, but as legislation works, by the time it got passed, it was to the extent practicable. What we are finding is that most local governments aren't aware of that mandate and aren't actually doing it because they find it's not practicable. So Rick Anderson, who's a member, came to me. He's also a retired lobbyist, who said, we can do something about this. And part of it is people don't know what pollinator habitat is. So we reached out to the Washington State Department of Agriculture to say we really want a pollinator habitat conference next fall in 2025. I met with them, uh, policy advisor named Allison, and she walked in and she said, oh, I walked in to meet with her to talk about it. She said, oh, I already know what you're here to talk about. This this conference you want to have us work with you on. Well, we're all in. We think it should be a 2-day conference, not a 1-day conference. And we want to have it on the east side of the mountains because it'd be much more affordable. We'll get a lot more people from the east side, and we'll be able to get the legislators we want to give positive feedback to. They'll be happy to drive over there to get that positive feedback. So we're on track to put on a pollinator habitat conference next year. Our vision is that we'll have another one that following year, because the best time to have a conference like this is at the second half of your biennial legislative session. So you can come up with ideas and be ready to have those fleshed out in time for the next legislative session, the first year, which is where most of the work gets done, most of the bills get passed, so that we could be syncing ourselves with, as we learn, we want to be able to go back to the legislature and ask for more. The Washington State Honeybee Keepers Association is proposing a what they call a personalized license plate, a pollinator license plate. We're working with them on what bees should be on it. And we are talking about the possibility of some of the money that the pollinator license plate generates, helping support or developing eco-region level 3, and you can ask me about that later, but native seed mixtures, which are uh, using plants from that ecoregion and using plants that we are figuring out are important to bees based on the pollen we take off and analyze from the bee specimens being collected as part of the Washington Bee Atlas. Other money from that would be going for bee research, including things like honeybee research. I mean, they're the ones that are sponsoring it. When I was talking to Allison at Department of Ag, she said there is something else we can do. The legislature authorized, put in legislation, the ability for the State Conservation Commission to offer small grants to private landowners to plant pollinator habitat. But the Conservation Commission has yet to actually ask for money to have to pass out. So we started working with the Conservation Commission to say, hey, there's a coalition of organizations that will be happy to back you in your request for getting money to run that program. Folks like the Native Bee Society, the Honey Beekeepers, Audubon, a lot of different organizations, Native Plant Society. So We think that we'll be going maybe during the second half of the session, or if not, then the following year, the next legislative session, to have the Conservation Commission request money from the legislature to be able to actually offer the grants. They've got an authorization to do it, but they haven't asked for the money to be able to pass any out. That's kind of where I am with my talk. I've got a few minutes for questions. There's some resources that are really good. The Bees in Your Backyard. Uh, Torah Ag has been doing some really good work on pollinators, including pollinator plant lists. And I think Katie Buckley's here. Thank you, Katie, for all your work. Um, Bumblebees of the Western United States is a really easy to use guide for helping start learning your bumblebees. It's hard to find in print now, but you can download a copy if you just search for it um, online. There is a bumblebee tool, WashingtonBumblebees.org. And then our society helps, like with our bee share at the first part of the meeting to learn more about bees. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Uh, I'm going to, anybody want to jump in and say what they think the answer to how many eyes does a bee have? Unless you're already on the board or you've been talking to Tony. And the answer is 5. The 2 big eyes that we see the compound eyes, but they also have 3 ocelli or simple eyes across the top of their head. So a total of 5 eyes. And when Tony was, asking this question to little kids at an outreach event we were doing at Woodland Park Zoo, it was so fun to watch the kids think about it. And then he had a picture, and just wanted to give Tony a lot of credit for being clever about how to engage kids with pollinators. The other question I asked was, a solitary bee lives for a year. How long does it live in adult form? It's laid as an egg, it turns into a larvae, then it hatches, and then, they come out and emerge and start making new brood cells for the next generation. The answer is for most species, unlike bumblebees, but most solitary bees, the individual bee is only flying on the landscape for 2 to 3 weeks as an adult. Really short period. So you can see where they're really focused on just gathering the pollen and nectar they need, finding the nest sites, and before they run out of time. So that's why most native bees are very gentle, really don't want to interact with you. They're so busy trying to get their work done that, unlike a yellow jacket nest, which has lots of workers that are happy to sting you if you bother them, the average native bee would just rather get out of your way. With that, I'll open up to questions.
Awesome.
James, if you have any in the
Yeah.
chat. Or...
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. That was an excellent presentation. And just as a reminder, everybody, while we may not have everybody that we had from earlier, Thursday, December 5th, David, if you don't mind speaking on that again. You said there were board elections and there were 2 unfilled seats.
Yes, 2 unfilled seats. So if you're interested in being on our board, please let us know. I'm really thrilled that everybody who's on the board is staying on the board. We have a really good team, and it'd be nice to have, a diversity. Well, what I find is a diversity of perspectives really helps us get to a better long-term answer on almost any question we have. So you'll add value.
Awesome.
And again, our membership meetings are usually the 4th Thursday of the month, but for December and November, that intersects with holidays, so we're having a combined meeting that Thursday, the 5th of December.
Great.